Usually when we look at a map, we expect absolute precision, right? You see a blue line, you know that's a river.
Yeah, exactly.
You see a black line, that's a border. A little star means it's a capital city. It is clean, it is categorized, and honestly, it is, entirely comforting.
It makes sense to our brains.
Right. We as human beings we love things to be visible and easily defined. But what happens when the map you are trying to draw is not of a physical landscape, but of the eternal mind of God?
You quickly realize that human cartography is just wildly insufficient.
Yeah.
When you attempt to chart out the eternal mind of the divine, specifically the eternal decrees regarding human salvation, you are stepping into a realm where human logic is stretched until it basically threatens to snap.
The lines blur.
The lines blur, the borders disappear entirely, and you are left staring into profound mystery.
And that is exactly the terrain we are venturing into today. So welcome to this deep dive into the source material. You, the listener, you are stepping into this alongside us, and we are going to need your sharpest critical thinking for this one.
Definitely.
We are exploring the intense, historically vital, and honestly often deeply misunderstood theological landscape of post-Reformation Geneva.
It's a fascinating era.
It really is. We are pulling directly from part 3 of Joel Beeke's massive scholarly work, Debated Issues in Sovereign Predestination, specifically chapters 13 through 18. And we are tracing the incredibly high stakes of how the generations following John Calvin tried to articulate the inner workings of God's sovereign will.
And trying to do that without falling into fatalism on one side or, human pride on the other.
Right, it's a tightrope. So our mission today is conceptual clarity. This isn't just a brief summary. We are going to go historically, sequentially, and we are going to unpack the doctrinal stakes.
The central tension we are exploring here is really how brilliant, finite minds tried to systemize the infinite.
Yeah, the ultimate questions of existence.
Exactly. Like, why does God save some and not others? How does God remain entirely sovereign without somehow becoming the author of evil?
Which is a huge accusation they were facing.
Massive. And most crucially, when God made these eternal decisions, in what logical sequence did he make them?
Well, let's start with the narrative that we've all been sold about this era, chapter 13, basically. Because according to Beeke, history has gotten this completely wrong.
Completely backward in a lot of ways.
Right. There is this prevailing assumption, it's almost a mythology at this point, that John Calvin had this beautiful, warm, deeply pastoral theology that was centered entirely on Christ.
Right, the biblical theologian of the heart.
Yeah. But then Calvin dies, and the guys who take over his academy in Geneva basically ruin it.
That's the popular story, yeah.
They supposedly turn this living, breathing faith into a cold, calculating mathematical equation. I mean, where did this narrative even come from?
The origin of that narrative can really be traced back to a specific 19th century scholarly thesis.
Okay.
It was heavily popularized in the mid-20th century by historians who were following the framework of a man named Alexander Schweitzer.
Schweitzer, right.
Yeah, scholars refer to this as the Calvin versus the Calvinists debate.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I've heard that phrase.
Right, it's very common. And the argument essentially posits that Calvin was this warm pastoral figure, while his successors, and specifically his hand-picked successor, Theodore Beza, were just rigid Aristotelian philosophers.
So they basically paint Beza as the villain of the story.
Pretty much.
The guy who took the beautiful symphony of the Reformation and turned it into a rigid flowchart.
Exactly. Well, I shouldn't say exactly because the historical reality flatly contradicts that framework, but that was the allegation.
That was the rumor.
Right. The claim was that Beza took the doctrine of predestination and elevated it to a central dogma.
Meaning the prime axiom everything else is built on.
Exactly. A grand, overarching philosophical premise from which all other Christian truths were just coldly and rationally deduced.
Wow.
They argued Beza built a deterministic system where human beings were essentially just cogs in this terrifying divine machine.
But Beeke's work meticulously dismantles this, right?
Yeah. Piece by piece. By going back to the primary texts, Beeke demonstrates that Beza was actually a faithful conservator of Calvin's pastoral legacy. He was not a philosophical corrupter.
To understand how Beza has been so misunderstood, we have to look at the specific theological battleground of the era.
The context is everything.
And that brings us to a word that, honestly, it sounds like a rare medical diagnosis.
Really, it does.
But it is actually the key to this entire era. Lapsarianism, the Lapsarian question.
Yes.
Now, I know the root here is the Latin word lapsus, meaning slip or fall, specifically referring to the fall of mankind into sin in the Garden of Eden. But how does that root word explode into the defining debate of the Genevan Academy?
Well, it becomes a defining debate because it attempts to answer how God's eternal decrees relate to that exact fall.
Okay.
When theologians talk about the Lapsarian debate, they were talking about the logical order of God's decrees in eternity regarding salvation and damnation.
I want to pause you right there because this is where my brain used to get completely tied in knots. And I bet you listening right now might be feeling the exact same way.
It is notoriously difficult to grasp at first.
We have to separate the concept of logical order from chronological time. Because when we say, God decided this and then God decided that, our human brains automatically picture God sitting in heaven on a Tuesday, making one choice, and then, waking up on Wednesday to make another.
Which is a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of God.
Right.
The theologians of Geneva understood that God is eternal. He exists completely outside of time, therefore, his decrees are eternal.
There is no sequence of days for God.
Right. There's absolutely no chronological sequence in the mind of God. He comprehends all things instantly and simultaneously. So the Lapsarian debate is not about a timeline.
Okay.
It is about a conceptual logical framework. It asks, in the architecture of God's eternal mind, which intent logically precedes the other.
The analogy I keep coming back to is an architect designing a house.
That's a great way to look at it.
Right. So if an architect is commissioned to build a home, the ultimate intent, say, to create a safe, warm environment for a family to flourish, that is the very first thing established in the architect's mind. That is the end goal.
Exactly.
Now, the drafting of the floor plan, the pouring of the concrete foundation, the framing of the walls, those are all just the physical means to achieve that ultimate end.
The means serve the end.
Logically, the desire to house the family precedes the pouring of the concrete. But chronologically, when the architect is holding the finalized blueprint, the entire vision exists simultaneously on the page. The blueprint doesn't experience time, it captures the whole design at once.
The end goal is logically prior to the means used to achieve it. That is the exact philosophical framework these theologians were using.
So they are looking at the divine blueprint.
Yes, they were asking, what was God's ultimate, logically primary intent, and what were the means he decreed to achieve it? In this question, this specific logical ordering, it split the Reformed world into two main camps, Supralapsarianism and Infralapsarianism.
Let's break those down. Supra, meaning above or before, and infra, meaning below or after.
Right. So Supralapsarianism argues that in the logical order of God's decrees, the decree of predestination, meaning to elect some humans to salvation and reprobate others to damnation, that decree comes logically before the decree to create humanity and permit the fall.
Wait, so in the supra view, God is making a decree about the eternal destiny of humanity before he has even conceptually decreed that humanity will exist or fall into sin.
That is correct.
He is looking at a completely blank slate.
He is looking at humanity as merely creatable and fallible,
Wow.
not yet created or fallen. The Supralapsarians argued that if God's ultimate goal is to manifest his glory, his mercy through the elect, and his justice through the reprobate, then that goal must be logically first.
Like the architect wanting to house the family.
Exactly. Therefore, the creation of the world and the permission of the fall are merely the means God decreed to execute that primary goal of predestination.
I mean, I can see why people find that terrifying.
Oh, absolutely.
It sounds like God creates a pristine world and then deliberately permits a catastrophic fall into sin just so he can have a backdrop to display his justice by punishing people. That just feels incredibly harsh.
The Supralapsarians would counter that you are bringing human emotion into divine prerogatives.
Okay, how so?
Well, their primary concern was protecting the absolute, majestic sovereignty of God. If you make God's decree of predestination logically dependent on man's fall, they argued, you are making the Creator react to the creature.
Ah, I see.
You were suggesting God had to, wait to see what humans would do before finalizing his ultimate plan. And to them, that was an unacceptable limitation on God's freedom.
Okay, so that is the supralapsarian defense of God's absolute freedom. But the other camp obviously saw massive red flags with that logic. What was the infralapsarian position?
Infralapsarianism places the decree of predestination, logically, after the decrees of creation and the permission of the fall.
Okay.
In the infraview, God decrees predestination, contemplating humanity as already created and fallen.
So the blueprint changes.
Entirely.
The foundation is the creation and the fall, and the predestination is God's response to that reality.
Yes. The Infralapsarians looked at the supraview and recoiled. They argued that if God decrees to reprobate, to damn individuals before he even logically considers them as guilty sinners, then you are inevitably making God the author of sin.
Which is the ultimate theological crime.
It is. You are accusing God of creating human beings for the express primary purpose of destroying them.
Right.
The intraview insists that God's election is a response of sheer, unmerited mercy to a race that has already plunged itself into ruin, and his reprobation is an act of sheer justice. He is simply leaving guilty sinners to the consequences they actively chose.
The tension here is just immense. The supras are terrified of compromising God's sovereignty, while the infras are terrified of compromising God's goodness and justice.
It's a theological tightrope walk.
And this brings us back to chapter 14 and Theodore Beza, because Beza is historically fingered as the grand architect of that strict, terrifying Supralapsarian view.
He is the poster child for it.
If we want to evaluate whether Beza was actually a cold rationalist, we have to look at the piece of evidence his critics point to most often. A document from 1555 called the Tabula Predestinationis.
The famous, or perhaps infamous, Table of Predestination. Modern scholarship has really weaponized this single document against Beza.
What exactly is it?
It was quite literally a visual diagram, a chart. It traced a line from the eternal sovereign decree of God at the top down through the various stages of human history, branching off into two distinct paths: the salvation of the elect and the damnation of the reprobate.
When you look at it with modern eyes, it just looks like a corporate flowchart.
It does.
It's easy to see why critics point to it and say, look, he took the living grace of the gospel and turned it into a cold, rigid algorithm. He made God a deterministic computer.
But context is everything, and the critics consistently ignore the context of the tabula.
What's the context?
Beza did not sit down in an ivory tower on a peaceful afternoon to draft a comprehensive, universal system of theology based on a chart. He was thrust into a fierce, intensely pastoral, and highly public theological street fight.
So it was a defensive weapon.
Yes. The Tabula was a polemical tract written specifically to counter the severe attacks of a man named Jerome Bolsec.
Let's talk about Bolsec, because he is the catalyst for this entire document. Who was he, and why was he causing such a massive headache in Geneva?
Jerome Bolsec was a former Carmelite monk who had become a physician and relocated near Geneva, and he began publicly and aggressively attacking John Calvin's teaching on predestination.
Just going right after the foundation.
Exactly. Bolsec's primary argument was that Calvin's doctrine of an eternal sovereign decree made God a tyrant. Bolsec essentially argued that if God predetermines everything, then God is the active author of human sin.
So he's saying Calvin's God is no better than the Roman god Jupiter.
That was his exact accusation. Bolsec favored a view where God's election was based on foreseen faith.
Meaning what?
Meaning, God simply looked down the corridors of time, saw who would eventually choose to believe of their own free will, and elected them based on their own future choice.
Which, to Calvin and Beza, completely destroys the idea of salvation by grace alone.
It guts it entirely.
Right, because if God elects you based on something you do, even in the future, then you have earned it. It ceases to be a sovereign gift.
Exactly.
So Bolsec is throwing these theological grenades, accusing the Reformed Church of worshiping a tyrannical monster, and Beza has to respond.
Beza responds with the tabula to demonstrate the biblical and logical coherence of the Reformed position. And he doesn't just draw a chart. He surrounds the diagram with extensive theological aphorisms heavily backed by scriptural proofs.
So it wasn't just bare logic.
No, he wanted to prove to Bolsec, and frankly to the terrified believers in Geneva who were listening to Bolsec's accusations, that this doctrine wasn't philosophical speculation. It was the clear teaching of the Apostle Paul.
But let's look under the hood of the tabula, because there is a crucial mechanism Beza uses to defend God against the charge of being the author of sin.
This is where Beeke is so helpful.
Beza makes a stark distinction between God's eternal decree and the temporal execution of that decree in history. Break that down for us.
This distinction is the absolute bedrock of Beza's defense, and it does require careful scholastic nuance. Beza argued that we must distinguish between the eternal decree of reprobation that exists hidden in the mind of God and the actual temporal execution of that damnation, which is the final judgment.
Okay.
Beza maintained that while God's sovereign hidden will is the ultimate primary cause of reprobation, the actual literal damnation of any individual is caused strictly and only by their own sin and voluntary corruption.
Okay, I have to push back here because this sounds like a distinction without a difference.
A lot of people feel that way.
If I am the listener, I'm thinking, wait, if Beza's chart literally maps out a line from God's sovereign decree at the top straight down to my damnation at the bottom, how does inserting the word execution absolve God of responsibility? If God drew the map, God is responsible for the destination.
The critique is understandable, but it ignores Beza's careful explanation of primary and secondary causes.
Okay, how does he define those?
Beza argues that God is the primary cause who establishes the overarching decree. However, God executes that decree by permitting the fall and governing all secondary causes without ever violating the nature of the creature.
Without violating the nature of the creature, meaning God doesn't force anyone to sin against their will.
Precisely the opposite of forcing them. Beza writes that mankind sins without necessity and without compulsion.
They want to sin?
They sin willingly from their own deeply corrupt nature. God does not inject evil into anyone's heart. God withdraws his restraining grace, and humans eagerly, voluntarily run toward rebellion.
Wow, okay.
As Beza frames it, God's decree is the ultimate hidden reason, but man's active, willing sin is the proximate, actual, and just cause of their damnation.
So God condemns, but he condemns justly because the individual is genuinely guilty of a rebellion they themselves authored.
Exactly.
It makes me think of the laws of physics. Gravity is an overarching law, a primary cause, that dictates an object will fall to the earth.
Good analogy.
But if I consciously choose to push a glass off the edge of a table, I am the secondary, active cause of that glass shattering on the floor. The law of gravity didn't force me to push it. My own will decided to act. Gravity simply governed the environment in which my action took place.
That analogy perfectly captures the dual layers of causation Beza was trying to articulate. He was holding two seemingly paradoxical truths in an iron grip.
That God is completely sovereign and man is completely responsible.
Right. God is absolutely, comprehensively sovereign over all things, yet man is entirely, inexcusably responsible for his own sin. Bolsek wanted to resolve the tension by abandoning God's sovereignty. Beza refused to let either truth go.
He held the line.
And Beeke points out that the tabula, despite its intimidating appearance to us today, was actually meant to be deeply pastoral.
Okay, pastoral. A diagram mapping out reprobation is pastoral. How?
Because it assured fragile believers that their salvation wasn't suspended by the incredibly fragile thread of their own wavering willpower.
Oh.
If salvation depends on my own free will, I could lose it tomorrow. But if my salvation is anchored in the rock-solid, eternal, unchangeable decree of a loving God, if the line on that chart originates in the heavens, then my soul is safe.
That is a profound paradigm shift. We view the chart as a cage, but they viewed it as an anchor.
Exactly.
But let's look beyond the tabula, which brings us to chapter 15. If Beza was truly this rigid, flowchart-obsessed determinist, we should see that exact same structural obsession in everything else he wrote over his long career, right?
That is the assumption modern critics make, and it completely crumbles when you actually read Beza's wider body of work.
It just doesn't hold up.
Not at all. When you zoom out and examine his life's output, the caricature of him as a cold scholastic simply evaporates. Let's look at his Confessio Christianae Fidei, his Confession of the Christian Faith, written around 1559 or 1560.
Okay.
This is widely considered Beza's most comprehensive, systematic presentation of doctrine. Now, if the critics are right, and predestination is his central dogma, you'd absolutely expect him to start the Confessio with the eternal decrees and coldly deduce every other doctrine from that starting point.
Because that's how a rationalist operates. You start with the prime axiom and do the math.
But he doesn't do that.
What does he do?
He doesn't even come close. He structures the Confessio around the Trinity, echoing the ancient Apostles' Creed.
Oh, wow.
He begins with God the Father in creation, moves to God the Son in redemption, and concludes with God the Holy Spirit in sanctification.
So where does predestination fit in? Does he give it its own massive, dominating section?
No, he places the doctrine of predestination merely as one topic nested firmly under Christology, the doctrine of Christ.
That is a massive theological statement.
It really is.
By placing predestination underneath Christology, Beza is essentially shouting that you cannot understand election apart from the person and work of Jesus Christ.
Exactly.
It's not an abstract mathematical formula floating in the ether. It is deeply, inherently relational.
It proves that for Beza, Christ is the mirror in which we must look to see our election. We don't stare into that terrifying, hidden abyss of God's secret will. We look at the crucified and risen Christ.
And we see this Christ-centered focus everywhere in his writing.
Everywhere. He wrote a shorter confession called the Altera Brevis, which means another brief confession. And do you know how much space he dedicates to the strict logical order of the eternal decrees in that document?
I'm guessing very little.
0.
Really? 0.
He doesn't even mention predestination. The supposed godfather of rigid determinism wrote a confession of faith that leaves the doctrine out entirely. It focuses entirely on Christ's incarnation, his death, his resurrection, and the vitalizing work of the Holy Spirit.
That completely shatters the stereotype.
It does. We see the same dynamic at the Colloquy of Mumpelgart in 1586, where Beza engaged in a massive debate with Lutheran theologians.
What happened there?
The Lutherans accused the Reformed of minimizing Christ in favor of a raw, naked decree of election, and Beza fiercely defended Christ's foundational role, arguing that Christ is not just the executor of election, but alongside the Father, Christ is the efficient cause of predestination.
But the most compelling evidence Beeke presents against this caricature is not found in Beza's academic debates or his confessions. It's found in his pulpit.
Yes, his preaching.
Beza was a pastor. He preached constantly. And when he stood before his congregation, he wasn't delivering cold philosophical lectures on Aristotelian logic. Beeke points out that Beza's sermons were warm, relentlessly practical, and deeply evangelistic.
His sermons reveal a shepherd's heart. He used the doctrine of predestination specifically to comfort terrified believers. He wasn't trying to satisfy their metaphysical curiosity about what God was doing before time began. He was trying to assure them that God's compassion toward them was eternally secure.
But I have to ask you about the mechanics of that pastoral care, because there is a stark contrast between the academic Beza debating Bolsec with scholastic distinctions and the pastoral Beza preaching to a grieving mother or a struggling farmer in the pew.
Very different contexts.
Right. How does a preacher actually apply such a heavy, eternal, unchangeable decree to the everyday, messy reality of human doubt? If I am sitting in that pew, terrified that I might be one of the reprobate on the wrong side of the tabula, how does Beza counsel me?
He counsels you through a profoundly important concept that became a hallmark of Reformed pastoral theology. It's called the syllogismus practicus, or the practical syllogism.
Okay, unpack that.
Beza explicitly commanded his congregation not to try to pry into the hidden secret decrees of God to discover their status. He warned that trying to climb up into heaven to read God's eternal ledger is a fool's errand that will only end in crushing anxiety or absolute despair.
Because the map of the divine mind isn't available to us, we can't access it.
The secret things belong to the Lord. Instead of looking upward into the hidden decree, Beza taught his people to look backward at the execution of the decree in their own lives.
Ah, looking at the execution.
Right. The syllogismus practicus works like a logical proof. The major premise is, whoever truly believes in Christ and exhibits the fruits of the Holy Spirit is one of God's elect.
Okay, that's step one.
The minor premise is, by God's grace, I find myself believing in Christ, hating my sin, and desiring to live a holy life.
And the conclusion?
The conclusion, therefore, is, I am elect.
Oh, wow. So you don't anchor your assurance in a speculative guess about what happened in eternity past.
Not at all.
You anchor it in the tangible reality of what God is actively doing in your life right now. You look at your own sanctification, even if it's imperfect, as a comforting retroactive proof of your eternal election. It brings the lofty decree down to the dirt of everyday Christian living.
It grounds assurance in the historical reality of union with Christ. Beza was constantly pointing his people away from philosophical speculation and toward the promises of the gospel and the reality of their changed lives.
So, having thoroughly acquitted Theodore Beza of being an unfeeling, rationalistic monster, we have to move forward in the historical timeline, getting into chapter 16. Beza eventually passes away, and you would naturally assume that because of his towering influence, the next generation of Genevan scholars just blindly adopted his strict Supralapsarian flowchart.
You would think so.
Right, but human nature and academic theology rarely works like that. What happens to the Lapsarian debate after Beza?
The historical record shows a fascinating diversity. The assumption that later Genevans simply rubber-stamped Beza's views is demonstrably false.
Really?
Yeah, Beza shows that there was significant, vibrant variation within the Genevan Academy and its wider network. While Beza was deeply revered, his specific supralapsarian view regarding the logical order of the decrees actually remained the minority position.
Who were the theologians diverging from him, and what were they arguing?
You had brilliant minds like Lambert Deneau, Franciscus Junius, and Antoine de la Faye. These men were either teaching at Geneva or deeply connected to its theological output, and all of them favored infralapsarianism.
The infraview.
Yes, they believed it was safer, more scriptural, and less prone to being misunderstood to view the objects of God's predestination as already created and fallen in the logical sequence.
And this wasn't just an internal, localized debate within the walls of the academy. This had massive international implications, particularly when we look at the famous Synod of Dort. Paint the picture of Dort for us.
The Synod of Dort, held in the Netherlands in 1618 and 1619, was one of the most important international gatherings of Reformed theologians in history.
Huge deal.
Massive. They convened to address the rising controversy of Arminianism. Now, Geneva, being the historical heart of the Reformed faith, sent two primary delegates, Giovanni Diodati and Theodore Tronchin.
And Tronchin was actually Beza's own nephew by marriage, correct? He was family.
He was part of Beza's inner circle. Yet, when the time came for the Genevan delegates to submit their official theses on predestination to the Synod, they respectfully but clearly distanced themselves from Beza's strict supra-view.
What language did they use in their submission? Did they openly denounce Beza?
They didn't denounce him. The Reformed tradition generally allowed for fraternal disagreement on the Lapsarian question. It wasn't heresy trial.
Right.
But they submitted theses with distinctly infra-language. They explicitly defined the objects of God's election and reprobation as individuals who were fallen in Adam, guilty, and corrupt.
So they basically concluded that the supralapsarian attempt to order the decrees prior to the fall generated too many philosophical vulnerabilities and pastoral misunderstandings.
Exactly.
It reminds me of the famous quip by Friedrich Spanheim, who taught philosophy and theology at Geneva a little later in the century. He reportedly said that he was a supralapsarian in the classroom, but an infralapsarian in the pulpit.
I love that quote. That statement perfectly captures the tension of the era.
It really does.
In the strict, theoretical, highly controlled environment of academic debate, the clean logical symmetry of supralapsarianism appealed to Spanheim's intellect. It offered an airtight defense of God's absolute sovereignty.
But the pulpit is different.
Totally different. The moment he stepped out of the academy and into the pulpit, looking out at a congregation of broken, terrified, sinning people, he preached infralapsarianism. Because infralapsarianism foregrounds God's incredible mercy to the ruined, rather than his abstract sovereignty over the uncreated.
Which brings us to the absolute pinnacle of Genevan orthodoxy, a man whose name is practically synonymous with theological precision, Francis Turretin.
The Titan of Geneva.
He takes the professor's chair in Geneva in 1653. And Turretin is the man who firmly, systematically, and permanently cements the infralapsarian view as the official standard position of Geneva.
Turretin's masterwork, The Institutes of Eclectic Theology, remains one of the most impressive achievements of Reformed scholasticism.
Let's define eclectic theology for a moment, because that's not a term you hear every day. It comes from a Greek root related to refutation or conviction, right?
Correct. Eclectic theology is a specific methodology designed to teach positive truth by systematically identifying, analyzing, and refuting opposing errors.
So he teaches by showing what is wrong.
Exactly. Turretin didn't just state his beliefs. He laid out his opponent's best arguments in their strongest possible form and then systematically dismantled them using logic and scripture.
And Turretin had a lot of opponents to dismantle. He was fighting a multi-front war. Let's look at the flanks he was defending. First, he takes aim at the Arminians.
Turretin fiercely rejected Arminianism, which, as we noted earlier, taught that God's election was conditional, based on God foreseeing who would eventually choose to believe.
Right.
Turretin argued forcefully that this theology inverted the universe. It made man's autonomous faith the ultimate decisive cause of election.
Effectively stripping God of his sovereignty.
Exactly, and reducing grace to a mere offer rather than an effectual power that actually saves.
But he wasn't just fighting the Arminians on the right. He was fighting a new, incredibly subtle movement on his left flank. Amyraldianism.
Yes, coming out of the French Academy of Saumur.
We need to spend some time on this, because Amyraldianism sounds highly technical, but its implications are massive. What exactly were the Amyraldians teaching?
Amyraldianism is often referred to as hypothetical universalism.
Hypothetical universalism. Okay.
The theologians at Saumur propose a modified order of the decrees. They argued that God's first decree was a universal desire to save every single human being on the condition that they believe. So God decrees to send Christ to die for everyone, hypothetically.
Hypothetically, because there's a massive catch.
The catch is the fall. The Emeraldians acknowledged that human nature is so corrupt that, left to themselves, absolutely no one will meet the condition of faith.
So everyone will reject the offer.
Everyone. Therefore, God makes a second subsequent decree to grant the specific gift of faith to the elect, ensuring they are saved.
Wait, I'm trying to map this out in my head. So God makes a universal decree to save everyone, knowing with absolute certainty that no one will accept it, and then has to make a secondary decree to actually save a few.
That's their framework, yes.
How did they not see the glaring contradiction in that?
That is exactly the vulnerability Turretin attacked. Turretin dismantled Emeraldianism by arguing it proposed a schizophrenic God.
Oh, wow.
It posited contradictory decrees in the divine mind, that God fiercely, universally loves everyone and intends to save them in one breath, but only actually intends to apply that salvation to a select few in the next.
It makes God seem conflicted.
Yes, and Turretin argued that God does not deal in ineffectual hypothetical wishes. What God decrees, he accomplishes.
So Turretin destroys Arminianism, he refutes Emeraldianism, but crucially, he also turns his sights on his own predecessor's position. He dismantles Supralapsarianism.
Yes, he does.
Turretin lays out 4 specific, devastating objections to the superview. What were they?
Turretin's critique of Supralapsarianism is really where we see the triumph of the infra position. First, Turretin argued that the superview implies that the very first conceptual act of God towards some of his creatures was an act of profound hatred.
Because he decrees to reprobate them before they even exist.
Exactly, decreeing to damn them before they even logically existed as sinners. Turretin felt this violently contradicted God's unspeakable goodness and love as a creator.
That is a powerful philosophical objection. What was the second?
Second, he argued it was intolerably harsh to suggest God created mankind in a state of pristine purity and innocence for the express primary purpose of illustrating his justice by damning them.
God does not create to destroy.
That was his point.
And the third objection.
Third, Turretin appealed to the definitions of mercy and justice. He pointed out that it is logically impossible for God to exercise mercy or justice toward creatures who are not logically conceived of as being miserable or guilty yet.
Wait, explain that.
Well, you cannot show mercy to someone who isn't suffering. You cannot exact justice on someone who hasn't sinned. Therefore, the decree of the fall must logically precede the decree of predestination.
That makes total sense. It brings me to a medical analogy. Imagine a brilliant surgeon.
Right.
The surgeon does not prescribe a radical, painful cursée, intense chemotherapy, or a double amputation until they have firmly, definitively diagnosed the disease.
Right.
In this analogy, the radical cure is election and the cross, and the disease is the fall. The Supralapsarian view almost seems like prescribing the cure before the patient is even conceptually sick.
That's a great analogy, and Turretin's fourth objection ties directly into that. He completely rejected the Supralapsarian idea that the creation and the fall were merely means to achieve the end of predestination.
God doesn't engineer the disease to show off the cure.
Exactly. God does not engineer tragedy just to show off his ability to rescue people from it.
So for Turretin, Infralapsarianism wasn't just a preference, it was the only safe path to walk.
It was essential.
It protected God's goodness because God is only condemning those who are already guilty and ruined. He is not the author of sin. Simultaneously, it utterly destroys human pride because out of this mass of entirely ruined humanity, God reaches in and saves some purely by his own unmerited grace, not based on anything good he foresaw in them.
For Turretin, Infralapsarianism was the perfect theological sweet spot. It maintained the absolute sovereignty of God without sacrificing his justice or his pastoral warmth.
So Turretin builds this impregnable theological fortress. He writes his massive institutes. He defends the faith with peerless logic. If you are sitting in Geneva in the late 1600s, you probably think the academy is secure for the next 5 centuries.
You'd have every reason to think so.
But moving into chapter 17, the tragic irony of this entire historical narrative is what happens next. The fortress collapses.
Completely.
And it doesn't take centuries. It collapses rapidly, almost overnight, in the very next generation. How does an institution with that much intellectual armor fall so quickly?
This is one of the most sobering chapters in church history, and Beeke outlines the decline meticulously. The seeds of compromise weren't planted by an outside invading force. They were planted by Francis Turretin's own colleague, a man named Louis Tronchin.
Wait, Tronchin, that name is familiar.
Yes, Louis was the son of Theodore Tronchin.
The delegate to the Synod of Dort.
The very same. So we are seeing a massive generational shift. Louis Tronchin was educated at that French Academy of Saumur we discussed earlier.
Where Amyraldianism started.
Exactly. So when he returned to teach at Geneva, he smuggled Amyraldian hypothetical universalism right into the heart of the academy. But even more destructively, he brought with him a new philosophical framework, Cartesianism.
The philosophy of René Descartes. I think, therefore I am. How does Cartesian philosophy dismantle a theological academy?
Well, Descartes' methodology was built on radical, systematic doubt. You strip away everything you have been taught, every tradition, every assumption, and you rebuild knowledge based solely on what human reason can definitively prove.
That sounds dangerous for theology.
It was. When Louis Tronchin introduced this into the theological classroom, he subtly elevated human reason above divine revelation.
He made human logic the judge of the Bible.
Exactly. He encouraged a posture of skepticism toward the historic confessions of the Church. The scholastic precision that Francis Turretin used to defend the faith was suddenly mocked as outdated, dogmatic, and unreasonable.
So the professor of theology is essentially teaching the next generation of pastors that human reason is the ultimate arbiter of truth. Did anyone try to stop this?
There was fierce resistance. Benedict Pickett, who was Francis Turretin's nephew, saw exactly what was happening and bravely tried to hold the line.
Good for him. What did he do?
He championed a document called the Formula Consensus Helvetica. Francis Turretin had actually helped draft this document specifically to keep Amyraldianism and other errors out of the Swiss churches. Pickett fought desperately to maintain the orthodox view that election is by grace alone, not based on foreseen faith, and that the historic confessions must be upheld.
But Pickett loses that battle.
He does.
The dam breaks. And the man who ultimately engineers the fall of Geneva is, unbelievably, Francis Turretin's own grandson, Jean-Alphonse Turretin.
It's tragic.
The psychology of this is fascinating and devastating. Explain J.A. Turretin's mindset.
Jean-Alphonse Turretin took Louis Tronchin's chair in theology in 1705. And J.A. Turretin was thoroughly, completely a man of the European Enlightenment.
Okay, so he's looking at the world differently.
Very differently. He looked at the massive, detailed volumes of theology his grandfather wrote, and he was embarrassed by them. He thought the precise scholastic debates over predestination and the Lapsarian question were a wild excess of a bygone barbaric era.
He is looking over his shoulder at the secular philosophers in Paris and London, and he wants their approval.
Exactly. He was driven by an overwhelming quest for Enlightenment toleration and cultural unity. He wanted to unite the Reformed, the Lutheran, and the Anglican churches into one grand, enlightened Protestant body.
But to do that, you have to find the lowest common denominator.
Right. And to achieve that unity, he felt they needed to strip away all the divisive doctrines. Predestination, the mechanics of the atonement, the strict definitions of grace. He viewed these as embarrassing obstacles to modern unity.
So what is his mechanism for dismantling his grandfather's legacy? How does he officially change the church?
Between 1706 and 1725, J.A. Turretin launched a relentless political and ecclesiastical campaign to abolish the requirement for Genevan ministers to subscribe to the confessional standards.
He took away the boundaries.
Yes. He successfully argued that pastors should no longer have to sign the Formula Consensus or the Canons of Dort. He replaced those strict confessional boundaries with a vague, generalized requirement to simply subscribe to the Bible.
And if you were just an average citizen in Geneva, that sounds fantastic. No creed but the Bible. It sounds so pure and pious.
It does.
But in reality, when you remove the agreed-upon interpretation of the Bible, you remove the entire theological immune system of the church.
It was a catastrophic move. Without confessional boundaries, anyone can read the Bible and claim it supports their novel, heretical views, and there was no mechanism to hold them accountable. J.A. Turretin thought he was creating a broad, unified, tolerant church. What he actually created was a theological vacuum.
And nature abhors a vacuum. Something is going to rush in to fill that space. Which brings us to the ultimate endpoint of this decline, a man named Jacob Vernet.
Jacob Vernet represents the logical, inevitable conclusion of J.A. Turretin's trajectory.
How bad did it get?
Well, if J.A. Turretin unlocked the door to the Enlightenment, Vernet ripped the door off the hinges and invited the secular philosophers into the sanctuary. Vernet wanted to make Christianity completely, unconditionally acceptable to the rationalists of the 18th century.
To do that, you have to get rid of anything that human reason can't fully comprehend. You have to strip the house down to the foundation.
Vernet didn't just strip the house, he destroyed the foundation. Vernet systematically eliminated the mysteries of the Christian faith.
Which doctrines specifically?
He abandoned the doctrine of predestination entirely, reducing God's sovereign decree to mere foreknowledge. He denied the reality of hell. But we went even further. He fundamentally compromised the doctrine of the Trinity and the absolute deity of Jesus Christ.
Wait, he denied the deity of Christ?
Yes. He reduced Christianity to a religion of pure, manageable human morality.
He turned the gospel into a self-help program with a thin veneer of religious vocabulary. Beeke points out the profound irony here by quoting a secular French philosopher, D'Alembert, right?
Yes. D'Alembert, a leading figure of the French Enlightenment, observed the church in Geneva and publicly praised its pastors. He wrote approvingly that the Genevan clergy had reached a state of perfect Socinianism.
And we need to explain what Socinianism is, because that is a damning indictment.
The Socinianism is a radical heresy originating in the 16th century that explicitly denies the Trinity, denies the pre-existence and deity of Christ, and denies that the cross was a substitutionary atonement for sin.
So it's not even Christianity anymore.
No, it asserts that Jesus was just a uniquely good man who gave us an example to follow. When D'Alembert praised Geneva for being Socinian, the secular world was cheering because the heirs of Calvin and Beza had essentially abandoned historic Christianity altogether.
I want to dig into the psychology of this disaster because the intent behind it is so terrifyingly relatable. If you sit down with J.A. Turretin or Jacob Brunet, do they tell you they are trying to destroy the church? Did they wake up and say, let's burn down the orthodoxy of the Reformation?
Not at all. Beeke's synthesis makes it clear that their intent was almost certainly apologetic.
They thought they were defending the faith.
Yes, they were looking at the massive cultural wave of Enlightenment rationalism, the scientific revolution, the elevation of human reason, and they felt terrified. They thought, if we cling to these ancient, mysterious, offensive doctrines of predestination and absolute sovereignty, the intellectuals will mock us.
We will lose our cultural influence.
Exactly. We have to adapt the message to save the church.
But the paradox of cultural appeasement is that in your desperate attempt to save the institution, you destroy the very soul of the institution. They thought they were building a bridge to the culture, but the culture just walked over the bridge and conquered the church. They produced a man-centered religion that wasn't Christianity at all.
The irony is profound. Francis Turretin fought with scholastic precision to protect the glory of God. His successors abandoned that precision to protect the reputation of the church, and in doing so, they lost both.
Which brings us to the synthesis of Chapter 18 and the ultimate takeaways from this deep dive. When we look back at this sweeping historical and doctrinal arc from Calvin to Beza to Dort to Turretin and finally to the collapse under Vernet, what are the primary conclusions Beeke wants us to draw?
Beeke provides several vital synthesizing truths. First, he demonstrates that the Reformed tradition was never the rigid, monolithic, deterministic block that modern critics claim it was.
It was much more diverse.
Yes. It was a dynamic, thoughtful, and highly nuanced tradition where Supralapsarian and Infralapsarian views coexisted fraternally. They debated fiercely because the stakes were high, but they recognized each other as brothers operating within the same confessional bounds.
And second, Beeke completely vindicates Theodore Beza.
Absolutely. The historical evidence demands that we drop the caricature of Beza as a philosophical corrupter. He was a faithful conservator of Calvin's Christocentric theology.
His tabula was a pastoral defense, not a deterministic blueprint.
Right. He utilized scholastic tools, but his heart was deeply pastoral.
But the third, and perhaps most urgent takeaway, is Beeke's stark warning about the sheer velocity of doctrinal drift.
The historical timeline is a warning siren. Theological compromise operates on a steep, frictionless slope. Started with Louis Tronchin introducing a seemingly minor philosophical adjustment, Cartesian doubt, and Emeraldian hypothetical universalism.
Just a small crack.
But that small crack in the foundation introduced an instability that rapidly led to Arminianism. And when J.A. Turretin decided that confessional boundaries were too divisive and dropped them in the name of cultural unity, it didn't lead to a vibrant, loving church. It resulted in total devastating apostasy in Geneva.
It led to a perfect Socinianism where the gospel was entirely lost.
Precisely.
If you are sitting at home right now wondering why a debate over the logical order of eternal decrees from 400 years ago matters to your life today, think about the immense pressure you face to conform to the expectations of our current culture.
It's the exact same dynamic.
We may not be facing the French Enlightenment, but we face a culture that demands we sand off the rough edges of divine revelation.
The pressure to make the infinite God palatable to the finite sensibilities of the current era is exactly the same today as it was in 1705. The temptation is always to look at the mysterious, uncomfortable, or unpopular truths of Scripture and say, we need to revise this so the culture won't reject us.
So I want to leave you our crucial third mind in this deep dive, with a final thought to wrestle with long after this audio stops. Consider the profound, delicate balance between the absolute necessity of doctrinal precision, the kind of robust, unapologetic precision Francis Turretin spent his life building, and the humble, awestruck acknowledgement of divine mystery.
It is a vital balance.
We have just witnessed how the brightest theological minds in the most prestigious academy in the world lost the gospel because they tried to make God completely comprehensible to modern rationalism. They tried to erase the murky, mysterious parts of the map to appease the culture.
It forces a mirror onto our own era. If the heirs of Calvin and Beza could lose their theological soul by trying to fit the infinite God into the Enlightenment's mold, how are we today being tempted to water down difficult truths just to fit the cultural mold of our own moment?
Where are we tempted to drop our confessional boundaries in the name of a false, superficial unity?
It is a profoundly sobering reality.
It really is. When you attempt to force the infinite, majestic terrain of God's sovereign decrees into a perfectly clean, socially acceptable modern map, you inevitably lose the awe, you lose the majesty, and ultimately, you lose the truth itself. Thank you for joining us on this extensive, unhurried deep dive into the source material. We honor the time you've invested here, and we honor your dedication as a true learner willing to wade into these deep, challenging waters. Keep studying the map, but never, ever forget to stand in absolute awe of the terrain.